Thomas Green here with Ethical Marketing Service. On the episode today, we have Kevin Hanegan. Kevin, welcome.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. Would you like to take a moment and tell the audience a bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work for a data integration and analytics company called Click, and I'm the chief learning officer there. And we help customers as well as our own employees make better use of their data, trying to drive from data to insights to value. I also teach at a couple universities around data literacy, data analytics, and work at the Data Literacy Project, which is on the advisory board, trying to help advocate the world to be a more data literate place. Yeah.
It's a great introduction. As I said previously, there's a bunch of stuff I want to talk to you about, but I think the theme, at least that I picked up, was you're an advocate of people being more data literate. So if you were to summarize that, how would you describe it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you might get many different answers from different people when you hear that. And that's one of the challenges is there's sometimes a misconception data literacy is about data science. It's about predictive analytics. And then there's a misconception that data literacy is about the analytics and the technical side. But in a nutshell, data literacy is for however you work with data in your role, how can you maximize the transition from data to insights and value? So meaning if you're working on the data prep side, you have a set of skills and mindsets that are needed to prep and transform the data. If you're consuming the data, like you already have someone build a report for you when you're trying to interpret it, you need to understand at a high level what the data is, what it's telling you. So for example, if someone gives you a statistical report and you have like 95% probability, that's not 100%. Like there's always risk there. We always see people say, well, you told me to do it. I'm like, no, the statistics didn't say it was 100%, right? It said it was 90% or whatever the confidence interval. So it's that whole spectrum. But I think the last misconception is, yes, there are skills involved. You have to understand data. It's not a technical thing. But a lot of that process of making decisions with data involves human skills and soft skills, like challenging your assumptions and mitigating your bias and listening to diverse perspectives. And so it really is a competency because you need some of those skills, but then you also need those mindsets, the growth mindset, to be humble enough to know when you don't have the right opinion and you need more, to know that your hypothesis could be wrong. All of that to me falls under, which is why I love it, right? Because it's part technical, part soft skills.
I think I read before in prep for the episode that being able to read data is not looking at a graph. Did you want to maybe elaborate on where the skills shortage is there?
Yeah, so my background is actually math and computer science, and I think part of it is the way we grew up. So I went to many years of school math, and there's never a situation where 2 + 2 didn't equal 4. There was never a subjective answer to a math question, and so then you hear the word data. I think a lot of people associate it at the high level with numbers and think that it's all facts, it's all objective. And so you said the bar graph, like that is the first step in the process is, all right, let's plot our sales by region and let's put it on a bar graph because it's used to show comparisons. But what is that really telling you? It's not really telling you anything. You need to then take that fact and turn it into an insight and kind of answer that so what question. And so sometimes what happens there is that's where the thought process comes in, is maybe the challenges are sales are down, but maybe that's not the right question. Like maybe our cumulative units sold are down, but maybe our profits are up. And that's really what we care about. So when we look at the chart, if we don't know what the question is, or the right question, we don't know how it's tied to organization, we don't know what it's telling us. You see on the news a lot with this misinformation, which and sometimes is deliberate. In the business world, it's not always deliberate. It's you have a data point that is true, and we're told to believe it's a fact, it's an objective point. But our interpretation of what that means to us in the so what is subjective based off of our experiences. And so that's why charts are useful as a starting point, but it's just a starting point. You then have to interpret what it means. And is that really trying to tell you to answer the question you're asking?
You mentioned in one of your answers about some of the biases. What would you say is the most common bias that people have when concluding from data?
Tough question. I would probably say confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is the idea that you see a data point, it conforms to your preconceived notion of what the answer is, and you're like, I'm done. So you look at the opposite of that. You look at science, you look at legal and medicine, you go with science and the scientific method. You have a hypothesis, and then you do everything in your power to try to disprove that hypothesis. And then when you can't disprove it, you have to assume that it's true. In business, we see a data point and it's not our fault. It's how the brain works. And we're like, I told you that was the problem. We don't challenge it. We don't question it. We don't say, when is there a situation where that could be misleading, where that number is true, but it's not telling you the whole story? We don't follow processes in business like you do in science to help us there. So the confirmation bias, what probably happens daily to many of us 3, 4, 5 times a day. I think other things we see a lot is more of the availability bias. The more we're exposed to something, the more we believe it to be true. And so we're very influenced from a marketing perspective. Sometimes on the better end, we can use it for good things, but then sometimes we just build this mental model based off what we're exposed to. And that's, again, one of the reasons I'm passionate about diversity and inclusion, because you're breaking down those siloed mental models of everything's right because that's what I've seen. Knowing that the world's a much bigger place, there might be other perspectives that are better than mine. And that bias creeps in every day as well.
Have you got any thoughts on sample size?
In terms of how big, or
in terms of making conclusions from perhaps a sample size which isn't big enough?
I mean, so we're giving a lot of people access to data now, and I don't think everyone has the proper training. So this goes back more of the technical skills. Like, I'm not saying everyone needs to be a data scientist, but maybe you partner with a data scientist, or maybe you partner with someone that can do inferential statistics, like inferring. But if you don't have the right sample size, or you don't use the right type, so you don't do a random sampling, we see a lot on news situations and outlets where we get surveys that say, 95% of the respondents voted for A over B. But to your point, when you look into the sample size, it's not a true demographic. It's not so much that there's not enough people in it, but it's not reflecting the reality of the situation. It's not randomized enough. So we draw inferences from it, which are less than ideal because it's not a true reflection. Now, it's not an exact science, but we saw that back in the US presidential election a few years ago, where no one predicted Trump to win. It ended up being the population and the sample sizes were incorrect. And the people that knew that were actually predicting that Trump would win. It all came down to the populations and the sample sizes and the people within those that they measured.
You also mentioned that some people do it on purpose and some by accident. Have you got an opinion or a data-based approach on should we say, the breakdown between those two?
Yeah, I like to believe that everyone's good by nature, right? But in reality, I'll split out between like the world where we live in and business. Obviously, everyone has built into their DNA. They want to succeed, right? They want to protect themselves. They have the lizard brain. It's let's protect everything at all costs. So I think, to answer the question, there's a fine line between, is it deliberate? Is it not deliberate? There's something in the middle that it's probably deliberate in your brain, but you're not consciously aware that you're doing it. It's your brain's way to protect yourself. It's the way that you were brought up. It's the way that you perceive threats, is you want to use the data to help yourself. That's just human nature. But that doesn't make it okay, right? We still have to challenge the data. We still have to mitigate our biases. But certainly you see it all the time. There are companies that use availability bias for advertising and marketing for their benefit, right? But that's not really unethical. I think it's where it's unethical. It's where you get into some of the things you see in news and politics, which we don't have to get into today, but they're using it for much more nefarious means, I should say.
Yeah, one of the examples that sprung up for me was The Apprentice is on at the moment in the UK. And they did some market research on a particular task and split into two demographics. And the demographic was boys, and there was 4 boys of which 2 said they'd buy the product. So the statistic that they gave to when they were pitching was 50% of the demographic we're going for are. And I don't know whether that was an example of intentional or not. As you say, maybe just trying to do what's right for me without really being too conscious of it. But it brings me to my next point, which is one of the things which I think that you're happy to speak about, which is understanding how the brain makes decisions. Yep. Would you like to open with that a little bit?
Yeah, so we have these things, but again, without getting into a psychology background, we have in our brain these things called heuristics, which are, the brain is a massive pattern matching computer, and we're exposed to hundreds, millions of inputs every second if you go through the 4 senses. And the computer would overheat if we intentionally thought about everything coming in and what it means. So unconsciously, without us knowing, or subconsciously, all that input is filtered through our brain through a level of filters. One of them is heuristics, which helps us make shortcuts for decisions, shortcuts so we don't have to think about it. So if we're walking down the street and there's a crane above us, and let's say it has a piano that it's loading into a skyscraper, we don't sit and calculate the probability of the wind having it fall and then land right on us. We just move to the other side, usually. That's us not thinking. That's the heuristic. And it's helped us for evolution to survive back when, we were fight or flight, just trying to survive. Now we're in a world where the world changes every day. And what was true yesterday is not true today. So these shortcuts are really, really good. The problem is they're using your previous experiences. So one, if you've never been exposed to something new, you're going to have a first response of, I'm going to protect myself, which isn't open and diverse and inclusive. The second approach is if you're in a situation where you're stressed and there's too much information, your brain is going to flip into that quick twitch. Let's make a survival response that might not necessarily be accurate. So when we talk about people using gut intuition versus decisions, I think intuition gets a bad rap. Intuition's not bad. It's your brain going into everything that's happened to you in your life and quickly looking for patterns and saying, you don't even consciously know, in 10 milliseconds, these 5 incidents happened 5 years ago, and this was the outcome, and this is what you should do. And then you know the answer. The problem is things change. And so that's why we're a victim sometimes of our environment. It's hard for us when we get exposed to new things. We have to consciously move out of those mental models. And the good thing is that the brain is malleable, so we can change those perceptions, but it means we need the growth mindset. It means we need to work in an inclusive way and get different perspectives to help us, remodel those, so to speak.
It does make me think, if it is the case, well, that's happening, that the brain is automatically recalling based on previous history, how much you want to, in the future, should we say, shape who and what you're exposed to based on that? Have you given that any thought?
I have. I mean, I think about it all the time when, we live in a community that is, everyone is for the most part similar, but I obviously, one of the things my wife and I talk about, we have 4 kids. I want them to study abroad because I was, not exposed to many things when I grew up. I want to have them take jobs where they travel the world and as early as possible see other cultures. I want them to be out of their comfort zone. But again, it's against human nature. A lot of us don't want to be out of our comfort zone. So I think that's the best thing you can do. And it's not impossible doing it when you're older, but it's a lot easier when you're younger. So it's starting at the kids level and trying to find schools that are inclusive, trying to find schools that teach different ways to think, allow you to learn critical thinking. One of the things we talk a lot about with my family is our kids are being taught how to pass a standardized test. They're not being taught how to question or critically think. And it's a different mindset. So there's a lot of stuff we have to do at the schooling level, but I completely agree with you. Getting them exposed early is key.
One of the previous things you said about working with, should we say, incomplete data, or maybe not making conclusions based on that because it's not 100%, makes me think of a quote that I heard from one of the big tech guys. I think it may have been Facebook, about how more data will always be the solution. So from my perspective, I think making a decision based on data is better than not making a decision based on data, if you see what I mean. So what's your approach there, or what are your thoughts when that quote springs to mind?
Yeah, and it might have been Jeff Bezos. So he did something in a public filing or annual stockholders report that said, look, we can wait forever till we get data. I'm paraphrasing, but we'll never have everything. So when is the right decision? And I forget what percentage he made, but he classifies them into two different types of decisions. One is a type where it's almost operational and tactical. You can revert back from it. So it's not a big deal if you make the decision and then realize with more information and more data, you have to pivot. The other one are more strategic type decisions, like we want to change our entire business model. And I think he puts a percentage against each one, but they're not 100%. They're like 50, 60%. And what he said, and I firmly agree, is that's not the same percentage for everyone. You as an individual and an organization have to figure out what you're comfortable with. But the point was, it'll never be 100%, or by the time you answer it, the business has already changed. On the flip side, it should never be 0%, because then you have no data informed decision. It's just going on guess, which is not good. So you kind of have to classify your decisions at the organizational level and put that percentage next to it of what you're comfortable with. Of course, he works in an environment and a culture where they embrace it's okay. I don't like to say fail. I like to say that they fall, but they learn from falling. There are some organizations where people are so nervous of making the wrong decision, they won't. And that's what stifles them. So saying all that, it's also important to be in an organization where the culture supports that all the way from the top down.
Have you got any thoughts on, because my audience is typically business owners, to what degree in typical business, if you can even say that, maybe an average, are owners making decisions based on data or based on intuition or perhaps biases?
Yeah, I mean, through Click, where I work in the Data Literacy Project, we've done surveys every couple of years around these things. And there's definitely more awareness with business owners and executives that they need to make data-driven or data-informed decisions. They realize the value of it. However, they also acknowledge that many of them are not doing that today for a variety of reasons. It could be that they don't have access to all the data. It could be that they don't trust the consumers with the data. And that's not just they don't trust them. It's that the people consuming it might not have the right training, or they might not have the right technology or the tools. So I think we are seeing kind of a evolution of now people realize they really need to use data in all types of businesses. I mean, the local pizza shop, the local Subway shops, they all can benefit from the data they see. And when we say data, it's not just quantitative, it's also qualitative, using anything unstructured in social media. So I think more and more are realizing the value, but that's kind of what we're trying to solve, is there's that gap there to, okay, how do I do that? And very few have been able to actually cross that chasm of actually being able to leverage the data in the right, more optimal way to help them make those decisions.
Have you got any thoughts on what the typical gaps are for a business?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the data pipeline, you start at the data level. It could just be that maybe you don't have the right data governance. If you're, in a certain business where information is sensitive due to GDPR or whatever, you don't want to expose this to all of your analysts. So it could be that level. It could be that the person who's trying to make the decision says, I don't know where to start. I don't know where to get this data. I know what I want to do. I want to look at the social media tweets and look at my sales and see if I can find insights of how I can better market. They don't have the data strategy. Some of them have that, but then in the middle, they don't really have the analytics process. And it doesn't have to be predictive. It could just be a customer 360 view. What is my key demographic? They don't know how to answer that. Are more people, high school, secondary school kids coming in to buy my food, or is it more elderly, or is it more, middle-aged workers that come in at lunch? They don't have that visibility. And then the final end is they might not be able to take those analytics, even if they have them. They don't have the right mindset to challenge what it's telling them. They're nervous that I see this, it says last week, to your point, that, 75% of my people that ordered French fries are high school kids. But if only 2 people came in, do you really want to make an insight from two people? They need education on data literacy to help them with those challenges to know what they need to do. And so I think those are kind of the big things across, loading the data all the way to finding that insight and then acting on that insight.
Have you got any software that you, should we say, prioritize or is a favorite for you to help?
I do. I work for Click, right? It's a data integration, data analytics software. So it follows that entire pipeline where we have tools that can help you integrate your data, bring it in real time in the right format. So it's, analytics ready. And then we have the analytics tools so people could do KPIs, measurement frameworks, dashboards, all the way up to advanced forecasting and predictions. And then ways to communicate it out and make alerts and notifications. So certainly I'm biased, but I think Click is the best tool out there that covers the whole pipeline for sure. And then we also offer training on data literacy, which is the soft skills and the tech skills around it as well. So
good for pointing out your bias there. Well done. But there was one thing that I wanted to ask you about, which is thinking fast and slow. Our internal operating system. Is that a reference to the book, or is that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So Daniel Kahneman and others, Amos Tversky, they came up with all these experiments and highlighted these heuristics, which is the thinking fast, aspect of it, where we consciously follow representative bias or availability bias or confirmation bias all the time. And then they give us strategies of how we can flip that. So instead of, we talked about the thinking fast is you're not actually consciously thinking, you just act. Sometimes when you have to make a strategic decision, you don't want to do that because it's a big decision. Things have changed. So then you want to recognize, am I making a thinking fast decision? Am I making a thinking slow decision? Is it that instant subconscious, or let's take a step back? And that's why sometimes when you hear people say, let me sleep on it, that's actually based in science, because you're trying to take the emotion out. You're trying to consciously think about it. Just like in kids' schoolwork, I always say my kids hate it, but math, they have to show their work. It's because it's making them not rush. And my son used to make stupid decisions. He would do a multiplication table. He'd always get it wrong. That's him thinking fast. He's not processing. He's not checking. He's not questioning. When they write it out, he has to question it. And then as a teacher, as a business owner, we can see where their assumptions might have been flawed. So thinking slow is saying, this is a big enough decision. I'm not going to go just based off of that thinking fast switch. I'm going to take a step back and I'm going to follow some processes to make sure I connected the dots and everything makes sense, and then make the decision.
Have you got any examples in your own sort of personal life where you sort of say, well, if I didn't have these skills, then that would have been significantly more difficult for me? Anything come to mind?
Yeah, and I share this one a lot because it's a personal story, and I think that's the key thing with data literacy is if you can explain it and get people to connect to it in a personal level, it's a lot easier than using a bit. So I could give you a business example where we're looking at sales, and everyone was like, "Oh my God, our sales are slumping," but turns out we just had we had a discounting problem. We were discounting too much, but you can't connect to that. So again, I have 4 kids. One of them has autism, so he has a lot of behaviors in school. And this was like the light bulb moment for me, which is where I got into data literacy in the first place. We had a team meeting. They captured all of the data of the behaviors. So what behavior was he having? What was the consequence? What did they do before? And we were talking to the school, and we were concerned that they were going to, kick him out and go to a different school because of all these behaviors. And as I said before, data doesn't lie. Facts are facts. They're objective. These behaviors happen. But I took a step back and I'm like, all right, I want to see more data. So it's challenging what's there. I want to see the timestamps, because my hypothesis was, well, if it's unstructured time, like right after lunch, or it's Monday right after a weekend, those are the times that he tends to act up. And then we can focus on those unstructured times. So we get the timestamps. And sure enough, it's not related to it's not right after recess or lunch. It's not right after. But I'm looking at all of the data. And one of the data points was, what's the consequence? And the consequence was, more often than not, he would go to the principal's office. So instantly I get this smile, and everyone's like, this is serious stuff. Why are you smiling? Like, your son might be kicked out. And I said, you have an assumption here where your data is right, but it's your interpretation is wrong. And what are you talking about? And said, your assumption is that kids don't like going to the principal's office. And they're like, no one likes going to the principal's office. I said, I know my son, he loves adult stimulation. So I went home, test the hypothesis, asked him, he's like, Dad, it was great. I kicked the teacher and they sent me to the principal and she read to me for an hour. I think I'm going to punch her tomorrow and see if I get 2 hours. And it was that light bulb moment and that shock and awe when I showed them, and their faces were like, that the data is the data. It doesn't lie. It's objective. But your interpretation of that is marred by not just bias, but assumptions. They had never seen a kid that liked going to the principal. And that was that aha moment to me that this happens in business every day. We make decisions based off of what we perceive to be true. And there's no way that that's always an absolute truth. There's always other perspectives that will be contrary to that. So we need to then go and try to find those other beliefs and use the hypothesis, the scientific method.
Does make me think a lot about incentives. So like, are your incentives all in the right direction? Does that make you think of any examples at all about how you've changed the data based on incentives at all?
Well, absolutely. It's, we do a lot, again, at Click and at the Data Literacy Project about helping organizations find the right key performance indicators. Because one of the best ways to be data literate is to make sure that what you're looking at ties to the organizational goal. So at a high level, what are the organizational strategies? What are the right key performance indicators? And then what are the right sets? So you have lagging indicators, which is like the results. So I have a sales revenue target, but then you can't really measure to those. Those are the outcomes. What you want to measure is what's driving me towards there. And those are the leading indicators. So how many sales calls am I making? How many opportunities do I have in the pipeline? How many marketing campaigns do I have running? And so we can visualize that all in dashboards. But to your point, there are many times if you pick the wrong actions and indicators, it has unintended consequences because people aren't thinking systemically. So one of the famous examples, which isn't a business one, but it was called the Cobra effect. Again, it's a non-business one because it helps people understand. There was a Cobra problem in India hundreds of years ago. And so their decision was, let's put a bounty on the Cobras. And every time you bring in a Cobra, we'll give you the equivalent of, $10. And rational thought process, right? Let's bring all those back. And fast forward 6 months, the Cobra infestation tripled or quadrupled. And everyone's like, how is that possible? It's because the KPI became a measure that then people were working towards. So they started building Cobra farms and farming Cobras so that they could then wait till their maturity, bring them back into the police station and collect their money. They turned it into a money-making machine, which again is rational and people need money. And it's a logical process, but it highlights if you pick the wrong KPIs, you're going to drive the wrong behavior. So if your support center has a objective compensated or an incentive to how quick do you handle the ticket, do you think they're really going to go the extra mile and help the customer if it takes longer? Or if your transportation company is tracked with how many times they're on time, if there's a reason why a bus or a train or a plane is always late, they're going to cancel the service because then it's not considered late. But it doesn't help the consumer. It doesn't help their business because then people are mad and frustrated. So absolutely, incentives play a huge part in this. And that's where we need to balance it with that systems thinking of, if we fix over here, it's going to impact over here, and let's make it in a balance. And then we don't tend to think systemically, which is another kind of challenge we have.
That is an interesting example you gave, though. Still recovering from that one. There is one that I want to ask you about, which is I think would be beneficial to the audience, which is your 12 steps. So 12 steps to make smarter, better business decisions. Do you want to, if you don't know it off by heart, perhaps list a few of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So the thought process was, we went through a lot today and we realized that there's so many things that you can kind of get stuck in the weeds with in terms of how do you make data-informed decisions. And just to clarify, we say data-informed. Many people say data-driven, but I like to go to the extreme. Data-driven to me means you're blindly following the data. You're not using your human intuition. So the most exaggerated example is the urban myth that someone drives off a cliff and they ask them why, and they say, well, the GPS told me to. That's data-driven. Data-informed is Well, I stopped because there's a cliff. I probably died. That's not a good thing. That's data informed. So we thought it was a good idea to come up with this structured approach that's two things. It's systematic and it's systemic. And so systemic means we're thinking about the whole organization. It's not just the opposite of that is working in a silo. So I fix my process. It breaks the rest of the org, but I don't care. Systemic is let's look at it in balance. And systematic means it's repeatable so that we can follow it every time. And the process goes through the stages of taking data and making the decision. So it starts with what is the question or the problem I'm trying to solve? And a lot of times, it won't go too deep, but a lot of times the challenge is we get a question that is not a good question to answer. It's like, how are my sales doing? I don't know. What does good look like compared to when? What demographics? So you kind of have to learn the art of questioning. And that's something we don't really do too well, is push back on our bosses, whoever that ask us those questions. You have to ask the right question. You have to categorize, as we talked earlier. Is this a decision that's strategic that we can't go back from? Or is this a quick decision, like what do I have for lunch, where I can use some of that fast twitch approach? Then we have to go to the acquire and find the right data that's going to help us answer that. And that's where we really have to think systemically. What are the drivers of this outcome? So the example I gave was sales revenue. We have to look at marketing campaigns. We have to look at what is our pipeline. We have to look at what our close rate is. All of these data points need to be thought of systemically. And then we need the data to be in the right form and make it analytics ready. Then we go into analyze, where it's okay, let's look at those dashboards. And a lot of people will use dashboards to say, yeah, my sales are down. Well, that's great, but that's not helping you. You don't know why they're down, and you don't know what to do because of it. So it's going from descriptive all the way into diagnostic, which is root cause analysis. Oh, it's down because we changed our discounting policy. We no longer need approvals, and now everyone's discounting 70%. Well, then our action there is let's change the discount policy. It has nothing to do with marketing at that point. So we go through the different levels of analytics. You come up with an insight. You come up with the result of an inferential statistic, like you mentioned, a sample set, or you have a confidence interval. Then what you have to do is think and challenge. So in the apply step, it's when could this number be misleading? What am I not thinking about? Did I get a diverse perspective? Am I mitigating that I might have confirmation bias? What are my assumptions I'm not thinking? I'm going through them quick, but there's a list and it's prescriptive. And then you try to say, okay, here's my answer. I've gone through everything. Here's my answer. Now, if this is just for me, I'm done. If it's for an organization, I have to go and communicate it. And a lot of times what fails is it's a big change management. So if your boss says, we're going to pivot and go from A to B, you need to educate them in data. What's in it for me? Why are you doing this? So it goes to the process of how much evidence do we show, how much information, how much best practices, identifying the stakeholders. And then the last thing is the assess phase, where if it's going to be one of those fast twitch where we can fall, we just want to learn from it, but we need a process to learn from it. What went wrong? What went right? How does that change my mental model? And then let's go back to the ask phase and see if we have to iterate through it again. And so it gives you this overarching approach where you can go through the different steps, make a better data-informed decision, and then iterate through it as needed after you keep assessing.
Thank you for the answer. It's a great answer, and thank you for summarizing it. You've mentioned about the scientific method, and there's been a couple of examples where, shall we say, human error has come into it. Have you taken the scientific method and applied it to any of those 12 steps at all?
Absolutely. So yeah, it's thread throughout. And the most important one, well, they're all important, but when you get into you've done your analysis, and then you're trying to the apply phase, where you're applying the bias, mitigating the bias, the assumptions, getting diverse perspectives. The whole goal in there's a couple sub steps, is when is this insight not true? When can this insight not be true? One of the tools we use is something called the ladder of inference, where you take a statement and it goes all the way up to an opinion. And then how do you work backwards to find out where you potentially had an incorrect assumption? And one of the famous examples is this cartoon. I can't remember the lady that drew it, but a girl brings her boyfriend home to dinner, and the mother makes a cake, and the boyfriend says, "Oh, that cake's interesting." That's what he said, right? Interesting. But then it goes and it shows the daughter it shows the mother, it shows the husband, and it shows the guy. What did they infer from that? And so the mother was like, oh my God, he hates my cake. How rude, get him out. And the daughter was like, similar, I can't believe he said that. But you follow the steps of their thought process, how they got there, and their actions were get him out of the house. And then you look at his thoughts and he's saying, oh, my mother makes it with apples. You made it with pears. I like pears better. It's interesting. So that inference was completely different, response of interesting being good to interesting being negative. You need to challenge it. When could interesting be seen as a positive? Is it always negative? That's using the scientific method. And then if you can't think of a scenario, then you're like, maybe he's being rude. But it's that whole process of questioning the insight to validate if there's any situation you're not thinking where you're misinterpreting it.
It sounds like a little bit like Socratic method and definition of terms. So we can be speaking about the same thing, but have a completely different definition for a word.
Exactly. And you see that in business, right? Like we said, how are my sales doing? You could define sales as units sold. I could define it as profit. You had probably 5 other definitions. And if you don't have the right definition, you're going to have very different answers.
In terms of, because I think it's a really interesting conversation. And I think your work is quite cool. Do you enjoy it?
I love it. Every day is different. Well, I do have ADHD, so I like to be all over the place. And I think one of the things about data literacy is you get to be technical certain times, you get to use psychology sometimes, you get to learn more about how the brain works. And every situation, even though there's a common approach, is different. So that I like that. And I do feel like we're making a difference because everyone can benefit from data. Even, just as the listener, if you think about, you're probably making 20 decisions with data every day. You don't even realize it. Data, some people think of data as numbers. It's information, it's evidence. It's the statement you hear on the news. It's am I going to buy the car? Here's the number. All those things are decisions where this can benefit. And it's not just oh my God, I have to do predictive modeling on which car is going to be the best car based off. No, it's like, what do I want to do? Why is this telling me that? Are they lying? Are they telling me misinformation? How do I challenge it? Like, to me, that's important in life. That's a life skill.
Do you find that the more you know about the topic, in some instances, the more difficult it is to make a decision based on everything that can go wrong?
I'm going to say yes and no, but I'll clarify. Yes, because the more you know to something, again, you unconsciously or subconsciously, you're cocky. You don't mean to be, but you feel like this. So the mental model, a mental model is how you see the world. You feel like you're confident in that. So you will do more of those fast twitch decisions. And it's good that you know that. You know everything systemically, but sometimes what that means is we forget to follow the scientific method because we have that. So my example I gave with my son, if I didn't know that my son liked adult stimulation, who knows? An adult, we never would have gotten there, right? We wouldn't have solved it. So absolutely, I needed to be close to it. But sometimes, like, let's look at the other side, the school and the teachers, they were so close to it. They just basically didn't even have to think, like, there's no way a kid likes adult attention. Like, so they were too close to it. So yes and no, it's all about balance. But that, again, is why it's a team sport and why diversity and inclusion is so important, because your view is going to be very different than mine. And I can't be closed-minded to your view because it's your view. And yours, quite honestly, is potentially, probably more important than mine and more relevant and more actual. So it's like you're building this puzzle of the world and I'm one piece. Why wouldn't you want to see the 20 other pieces to know where it fits? Why do you just want to focus on yours?
Bring up an interesting point because it perhaps gets to how you deal with people who make decisions based on opinion rather than data. Because there's a couple of things. There's, should we say, being tolerant, meaning being patient and perhaps seeing things from other people's perspectives. And then there's perhaps the objective side of it, which is actually, this is not a debatable point. This is just a fact. Have you struggled with that at all based on what you do?
Yeah, again, it's a lot easier to improve when you're younger, but we see it a lot. And we try to teach, it's about education. We try to teach people, like you mentioned, discussion. When we're making a decision, I don't want to have a discussion because a discussion is basically a debate. All I'm doing in a discussion is I'm trying to get you to agree with me. I'm not listening to you. I might say I am, but I'm thinking everything you're saying, I'm thinking how I'm going to counteract that. Whereas if you come into it with a dialogue, the whole point is you're suspending any assumptions. You're listening to the other person and seeing how that fits into your model. And so that type of education of dialogue versus a discussion is critical. Also, it's about having the right skills as a facilitator or coach to challenge them, ask open-ended questions. One of the biggest things I always talk about is show your work. I said we do with our kids. So this was your answer. Tell me why you came to that conclusion. And by doing that, they're going to talk about it. And what will happen more times than not is they will expose something that is an implicit assumption. They think this to be true and it's not. And then that's where you can say, oh, it's because you're assuming that your assumption is that our customers are like this. Well, did you know the past 2 years, our customers are completely different? And then it's like, okay, then you can have that dialogue. But if they just give you the answer and that's it, and it's closed-minded and there's no dialogue, there's no open-ended questions, it's really tough because people do not inherently like to be proven wrong, especially in a business setting where there's a culture and your boss is there. Like we sometimes make poor decisions because we fear the groupthink approach. We fear of going against the norm and going against our bosses.
What's one of the things that you're happy talking about, if I'm not mistaken? And I did want to ask you about it. Groupthink.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
So it is a form of bias, but groupthink is also more cultural, right? So a bias to me is very individual, like a confirmation bias. I see my data point, I prove it. I believe it to be true. I don't try to challenge it. Groupthink is more a social and emotional component of organizational decision making. So you have either your manager or you have everyone in the team making a decision. You do not want to go against them, even though you have a different perspective. So you feel like you can't speak up, even though you think it's the right decision. And you see this played out a lot, like in the Space Shuttle Challenger and NASA. It wasn't the root cause, right? The Challenger would have blown up, but people all had to go through and say go, no go. And everyone was saying go, except for a group that had the concerns. And with groupthink, you're like, if I say no go, I'm going to get fired. Or if I get no go, they're going to think less of me. So human nature is you don't do it. Again, in the US, we saw it with President Kennedy when he started with the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs. And we won't go into a lot of details, but the first interaction, the Cuban Missile Crisis, we just started in office, and he was getting with his FBI and his military, and everyone was like, this is President Kennedy, I'm going to tell him what he wants. And it didn't go well. It ended poorly for US, but then he reflected, he used the assess, and he brought in outside psychologists. I think one was from Harvard and MIT, and said, what can I do different? And so he set up in the next, potential military issue, 2 separate groups. He had people in each group separate answering the same question. He stayed out of it. So no one said, oh, I'm going to go into president. And then he appointed devil's advocates for each one. One of them was his brother, Robert, in one of the groups. And the output was remarkably better. It was how they challenged. He identified, I have groupthink and I don't want to have it again. How do I fix it? So again, that's a summary. You can read about it online, but it was a fascinating example of the power of groupthink, especially would you say no to the president of the United States and tell him he's wrong? I wouldn't, but at the same time, would you say no to your boss if you're in an organization where a culture, says don't challenge me? So it's a big problem, but it's a blend between individual bias and more about your bias, but it's not because of your brain, it's because of the social emotional, fear of the organization shunning you.
These types of conversations remind me a lot about philosophy.
Yeah.
Have you heard of the is-ought problem?
No. Well, I might have, but I don't remember at this point.
So it's you can't get an ought from an is. So there's the data, and then how you should act on that data is basically up for debate in a way.
Absolutely. The data is objective. Your insights from the data is subjective.
I guess you need some sort of You need some sort of goal to work to in order to make the decision. That's I don't know, maybe that's a bias of mine. That just comes to mind, but I have to check myself on these things after this conversation.
Well, no, you're right. I mean, there is a form of analytics, exploratory data analytics, which is like, here's a haystack, go find a needle. But a lot of times, there's value in that. But 90% of what we're going to do at organizations is you have to have a goal in mind. It has to tie to an organizational strategy. It has to tie to those alignments. You have to have the right KPIs that you can drive towards. But there is that find the needle in the haystack approach. And that's used many times where you just want to learn things. But if your boss comes to you and says, here is a terabyte of data, go find me an insight, you have your work cut out for you. The best thing would then be question, well, what are you trying to find? What are your goals? Where are our numbers down? What are your KPIs? Are they trending up and down? And I think a lot of times we suffer from not just groupthink. We don't know how to question what we're told. We just do it. And that's where we could also benefit from more education on the art of questioning and critical thinking.
There's a lot of good stuff in this particular episode, so thank you for that. In terms of actionable steps, do you maybe conclude by saying here's a takeaway for people who want to improve in this particular field?
Yeah, I'll do a small and a big one. A small one, anytime you make a decision that is bigger than what am I going to have for lunch? Which way am I going to drive on the highway? Something that, strategically could change work or life or whatever. Pause. I'm not going to say sleep on it. That's cliche. And think about why you're making that decision and actually write it out on paper or speak it to a colleague. And showing that work is going to help you bring those fast twitches out and look at things. That's the smaller end. The bigger end is, I would say, use a process, use a methodology. We have one in the book. It's not the only one. Google decision science, decision intelligence, decision-making methodologies, and just adopt one that allows you to question the data. And again, data is not numbers. Question the information, question the evidence, be skeptical. And it's not saying that we need everyone to be pessimistic and say no to everything. That's not what we're saying. We're just saying, don't say yes to everything. Think about it. Just use your brain.
Any thoughts on people who sort of see it as futile based on let's say, data can be flawed and therefore they won't accept data? Have you got any thoughts there?
Yeah, those I call them data doubters. It's really, for them, they need to adopt a growth mindset because, the world is very different than how it was even just 5, 6, 7 years ago. And you need this new mindset. This is not something that's going away. This is not something that, if you just close your eyes and forget about in 5 years, the myth has gone and something else has come. Like, this is with us. It's only going to get more and more. Some people say, I don't need to learn these because AI and automation are going to take over the world. Well, they're not. AI and automation are not going to challenge assumptions. They're not going to mitigate bias. They're not going to look at the sample size and say, from a soft skill perspective, was I inclusive? So we always need to challenge these things. And I think they're just lacking a growth mindset, I guess. And I guess the question then becomes, how do we get them to get a growth mindset? I wish I had that answer. I'd probably be a billionaire at this point. But that's the goal, at least, is to get everyone to have that growth mindset.
Do you find that you're quite rare in the instance of combining, let's say, a data approach and also a growth mindset?
Maybe not rare in data and growth, but I think intentionally I'm rare in technical and soft skills. So as I said, I went to school for computer and math, but then I also knew that that's only half the equation. So then went to master's school for more around organizational development, adult learning, psychology, so that I can blend the two. I think that's a rare approach. But I do see a lot of data scientists that do challenge things quite a bit and have a growth mindset. It's just a few people don't have the soft skills, and it's not their fault. We don't teach them. Like active listening, you probably listen 10 times more than you write and speak. Fair, right? But have you ever taken a class in listening?
I've done an episode on listening, believe it or not.
Yeah. Well, that's perfect, actually. It's better than most. But in primary, secondary school, you were never taught listening, yet you spend hours a day taking courses on reading and writing. It's the most used. So, I'm saying it's not everyone's fault, but we all can change. just because we didn't learn this younger, it's not an excuse. We kind of need to go forward. So yes, there are some people that don't have a growth mindset. I don't think it just maps to data scientists. I think it's people that just haven't seen the light and the value, and there still is time.
What are your goals, Kevin?
Cheesy, but make the world more data literate would be great. Help people make a difference. I mean, that's one of the reasons I like doing this. There is definitely an organizational and business impact to this, but everything we see in the news today, everything with changes in society and climate change and political issues, this approach helps all of that stuff. And so if it's the thing that I can do to help educate people and help people make a better decision that helps the climate, helps political situations, saves the economy, even if I'm 100 steps removed from that, I'm happy about it. So I feel good about trying to make a difference. I don't know if I've done it yet, but that's why it's a goal. It's something that I want to reach towards.
Well, if people do want to find out more about you, or perhaps Click, where do they go?
Absolutely. For me, you can go to LinkedIn, just Kevin Hanegan, or you can go to my website, kevinhanegan.com. For Click, I would just go to click.com, QLIK.com, check it out. And then also I get the Data Literacy Project. So you can go to thedataliteracyproject.org and find a ton of tools, resources, community membership of how you can help improve your data literacy yourself.
Thank you for that. I think you've been a great guest, and I really enjoyed the conversation. So, Kevin,
awesome. Likewise. Yeah, I appreciate the time. Thanks.